So hello everyone, I'm Zackory Erickson, and today I'm going to share with you my PhD research on developing robotic caregivers, namely physics-based simulation and capacitive servoing techniques for physical human-robot interaction. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my committee, whom I've had a blast working with throughout my PhD. This includes Professors Charlie Kemp, Karen Liu, Sonia Chernova, Greg Turk, and Peter Abil. So my research focuses on intelligent physical assistants, where robots are in close physical contact with people. These robots aren't just standing next to a person, they're touching the person, applying force, sensing, and manipulating the human body. An example from my research on what this close physical interaction can look like is bathing assistance, where a robot is using a wet washcloth in order to clean off a person's body. Or dressing assistance, where a robot is helping someone with disabilities put on a fresh set of clothes for the day. Robots present an opportunity to have a profound impact and improve the quality of life for millions of older adults and people with disabilities. I really envision a world where robots are able to safely and intelligently interact with people on a physical level. But because of this close physical contact, robotic caregiving does present some crucial challenges. One of the first challenges that we face is common sense. How do we give robotic caregivers the ability to recognize how their actions physically affect people? Another challenge in robotic caregiving is the complex mechanics involved and a lot of visual occlusions, which means that we need sensing techniques that extend beyond vision. And additionally, safety is a significant concern since robots are in physical contact with people, and this has implications on how we can conduct research. For example, it's very difficult and costly to collect real-world data because of safety concerns. So today I'd like to share with you a number of techniques that I've developed throughout my PhD towards overcoming these challenges and enabling intelligent physical interactions. We'll look at how robots can take on a person's perspective from a physical point of view to estimate the forces that are being applied onto a person's body. In order for robots to interact with people, they need to be able to sense the human body. So I'll introduce capacitive servoing, a new sensing technique for robots to sense and navigate along the human body. And at the end, we'll dive into a topic that I think is really exciting, which is how we can use physics simulation to safely train assistive robots and benchmark physical human-robot interaction. So this thesis will focus on how robotic caregivers can leverage simulation and capacitive servoing to more safely and efficiently assist people with physical disabilities to perform activities of daily living. Now, to start off, let's look at the technical details behind how robots can take on a person's perspective and predict how their actions apply force onto a person's body. My research has applications in robotic caregiving, and although past research in this domain has robots interacting with people or with human models, these robots are not yet inferring how their actions will physically affect a person. This is especially true within the context of robot-assisted dressing, where robots are helping someone get dressed. Assistive robots lack the ability to take on a person's perspective. And this really begs two questions. First, what is perspective taking? And then how could it be useful to robots? So perspective taking is defined as viewing a situation or concept from an alternative viewpoint, such as from another individual. And within the psychological literature, researchers have shown how perspective taking within humans can evoke altruism, cooperativeness, and even empathy. Perspective taking helps human caregivers be empathetic and recognize how their actions affect someone receiving care. And robots could benefit from those same skills. Within robotics, prior literature has investigated what is known as visual perspective taking. In this example above, there's two wrenches on the table, and the robot can see both of them. So if the person in the figure asks for a wrench, from the robot's perspective, it's unclear which of these two wrenches the person wants. But you may notice that the person can only see one of the two wrenches. There's a box that's obscuring sight of the other wrench. So if a robot can take on a person's visual perspective, the robot can help reduce this ambiguity and infer which wrench the person is likely referring to. And visual perspective taking for robots have been investigated from several angles in the past, from building simulations of visual perception for robots and people, visual perspectives through a mirror, and generating robot-based configurations that match a person's perspective. In comparison to past literature, my research introduces haptic perspective taking, which enables an assistive robot to infer what people experience with respect to the sense of touch. For example, since safety and comfort are important during assistance, one natural question for us to ask is, well, can a robot estimate the forces it applies onto a person? Yet for the task of robot-assisted dressing, this question can be a little bit difficult to answer. First, deformable cloth is making contact with a person, which results in these complex force distributions. Visually estimating the coupled cloth and human body state remain exceptionally challenging to this day. And it's difficult for a robot to take on the haptic perspective of a person. Our somator sensory system, our skin, it's wonderful for us, but it doesn't provide robots with much data. So to overcome these challenges, we've designed a physics-based simulation environment, which allows us to simulate how fabric applies force onto the human body. And this environment consists of a few different elements. First, a robotic end effector pulling on the sleeve of a hospital gown onto a simulated human arm. And the colors that we see here on this arm are what are representing a force map, where blue is low force and red is high force applied at specific regions along the limb. And what I'd like to show you is how robots can use low-dimensional haptic measurements from their end effector in order to estimate a high-dimensional force map across a person's body in real time during assistance. This will allow a robot to take on a person's perspective and view this task from a person's point of view in terms of how the person is having forces applied to their body. So again, I'd like to share with you a novel technique in which robots can use low-dimensional local haptic measurements from their end effector combined with learning using temporal features in order to estimate high-dimensional forces applied onto a person's body by this deformable fabric. Now, these force maps, they may look continuous and smooth over the arm, but they have a discrete representation underneath. So let's briefly look at that since it's going to impact how we learn these force maps. So the human arm is discretized into 300 force sensing points. You can think of these as little force sensors scattered along the limb. And a vertex on this deformable cloth mesh will make contact with the simulated body at some arbitrary position X, and it's going to apply some force F. We're then going to distribute the magnitude of that force to the nearby force sensing points along the limb. And if we were just to color each of these force sensing points according to how much force is being applied to each one, we'd end up getting a figure that looks something like this. And then what we do is we perform an interpolation across all these points in order to generate a nice smooth force map along the arm. So now we want robots to be able to estimate these force maps. And the way we're going to do this is by building an estimator, a function f, that takes as input prior end effector measurements from a robot, as well as a current measurement from the robot, and then uses this information in order to estimate a force map across a person's body. And it's important to note here that this estimator does not have an explicit model or observation of the fabric. It's estimating force maps just from end effector measurements alone. So we're going to be getting these measurements in simulation from the robot's end effector. This includes haptic and kinematic measurements, force, torque, and velocity. And in terms of the real world, these measurements are also going to be quite easy for us to collect. We're going to be doing so using a force torque sensor. And this sensor is connected to the fabric garment, which a robot will also be holding. Now, in terms of implementing this estimator, we're going to do so using a recurrent neural network. And at every time step, this network will take as input those 9-dimensional end effector measurements, and then output for us an estimated 300-dimensional force map across a person's limb. Now here we're using a long short-term memory or LSTM network for this estimator, but there are certainly other types of architectures or temporal models that would work here. What is important is to have some form of model that leverages temporal features. Since manipulating cloth is a highly dynamic process and estimating how the cloth is interacting with the person's body relies on information from past cloth states. So we can train this recurrent network using simulation. In this case, we perform 5,000 randomized dressing sequences in simulation, where the robot is just moving around randomly in a self-supervised fashion with the goal of collecting lots of data of how fabric interacts with the human body and applies force onto a person. So we can obviously collect lots of data in simulation and train our estimator on that, but what happens is that if we just try to naively use this estimator, we end up getting some really weird scenarios like this, where the trained model is estimating these tiny forces all over a person's body, even though the cloth isn't in contact here. And this is just regression error. This is error in our recurrent neural network, where the model is constantly estimating these small forces all the time. So to overcome this, we build a contact map, which a robot will also be estimating. And just like the force map, This contact map will have 300 points, one for each corresponding force sensing point on the limb. And this contact map is set up just like a binary classification problem, where for each point along the arm, it's going to be assigned a value of 1 if the cloth is applying some non-zero force at that point. Otherwise, the contact map will receive a value of -1. And then if we bring this back into our recurrent neural network, we're now going to be estimating both the force map across a person's body, but now also this contact map. So we're going to be estimating a 600-dimensional vector. And what we can do after performing an estimate is loop through all of the forces in the force map and zero out any of them in which the contact map indicates that there's no force being applied. So this is going to allow a robot to estimate both how much force is being applied onto a person's body, but also if force is being applied at specific regions along the body. And this is, again, just to overcome these small errors in our regression model. And in practice, we find that it works quite well. So let's look at that. How well are we able to estimate these force maps in simulation? On the right-hand side, we'll be showing the ground truth force maps from our simulator. This is the forces the fabric is actually applying to the simulated arm. And on the left-hand side, we're going to be visualizing the estimated force maps. This will be the output of our recurrent model. And here we're looking at two different scenarios of this hospital gown being pulled onto an arm here, the sleeve of a hospital gown. In this first case, the sleeve goes along the forearm and kind of tugs and pulls at the elbow. And in this second case, the sleeve is going to miss the forearm entirely and just get dragged over the upper arm. What we're seeing is that in both instances, the estimated force maps from our model are closely aligning with what we would expect to observe from ground truth from the simulator. And this learning-based technique also generalizes to other tasks with deformable fabric, such as pulling a pair of shorts onto a leg, where here the shorts get caught on the heel of the foot and start to tug and apply force there. But the big question is, well, can this generalize to real robots interacting with real people? It seems possible, since our recurrent network only needs measurements from a robot's end effector. It doesn't need to know anything about the state of this high-dimensional cloth. But instead of just estimating force maps, let's take this one step further and look at how real robots can predict these force maps into the future. Doing so will allow us to explore this question of, well, how will a robot's future actions apply force onto a person? Can we select actions that minimize future force? So in order to predict force maps into the future, we're now going to set up two different models, both a predictor and an estimator. And this first model, a predictor, a function g, is going to take as input prior measurements from a robot's end effector, but now also this set of future candidate actions for the robot to execute. And then given this information, we want our predictor to output for us a set of predicted future measurements that a robot could expect to see if it were to execute those future actions. And here h sub p is the prediction horizon. That's how far into the future the robot is looking. And if you're familiar with what a dynamics model is, this predictor is essentially a dynamics model. And in order to map measurements to force maps, we're going to use the exact same estimator that we've already trained, but I want to change the notation of it a little bit. So now this estimator is going to take as input, again, prior measurements, but now it's also going to take in these predicted future measurements. So we're going to pass the output of our predictor into our estimator. And then this will have the estimator outputting for us a predicted future force and contact map. And again, we're using the exact same estimator that we've already trained that we saw just a few slides ago. But now what's really cool about this is we can start to do function composition where we have f of g, and that's going to allow us to go directly from robot measurements and future actions straight to a predicted force map across a person's body. And so now we can piece together our predictor with the estimator, and we can predict force maps across a person's body that a robot could expect to observe if it were to execute those candidate actions from the left-hand side. And in terms of implementing this predictor and estimator, well, the estimator is really easy. We've already trained it and implemented it, so we're just going to use it here. But now in terms of the predictor, well, we're going to use the same recurrent neural network architecture that we used for the estimator, but we're going to train a separate model. This model will have different inputs and outputs. But a nice thing about this is we can use the same self-supervised training approach that we used for the estimator to also train the predictor. And so we'll collect thousands of randomized dressing sequences in simulation and use all that observed data to train the predictor. And at this point, we now have a model for predicting these future force maps applied onto a person's body. So how do we use these force maps to control a robot? Well, we're going to do so using a technique called model predictive control, or MPC, in which we select actions that minimize the cost function shown above here. Now, I apologize for just throwing a bunch of arbitrary variables in the slides. Let's walk through what each of these terms are going to be doing for us one by one. This first term in our cost function is going to be minimizing the predicted forces across a person's body. This is that term that's going to be minimizing these predicted force maps we've been talking about so far. The second term is going to be encouraging the robot to be moving forward along a person's limb, essentially making task progress. And the last term is going to be discouraging the robot from rotating its end effector whenever possible. And so that's it to this controller. We then set up a human-robot study wherein a peer-to robot assists 10 able-bodied participants with the task of dressing on the sleeve of a hospital gown. We're going to be looking at two different scenarios here. First, can the robot fully pull on the sleeve of a hospital gown? And then second, can the robot mitigate cloth from getting caught on a person's body? And what we're going to be doing here is varying the prediction horizon anywhere from 0.01 seconds all the way up to 0.2 seconds. And that's that H sub P, that prediction horizon that we'll be changing. And so if we prevent the robot from looking very far into the future, we observed that the robot doesn't recognize that it's about to apply large forces onto a person's body until it's already too late. It's starting to tug and pull at a participant's elbow. Yet by allowing the robot to predict further into the future, the robot recognizes that it can continue to minimize forces by rotating around the person's elbow and pulling the garment all the way up to the person's shoulder. And the robot successfully pulled a garment up to a person's shoulder in almost all the trials that we had tested with participants. Similarly, if we prevent the robot from looking very far into the future, the robot doesn't recognize that a garment is about to get caught on a person's hand and apply large forces until, well, it's already too late. The garment has gotten caught and it's starting to tug and pull. Yet by allowing the robot to predict further into the future, the robot is able to recognize that a garment would soon get caught on a person's hand. It then lowers its end effector closer to a person's body, shown here by this red line. And this allows the robot to mitigate the garment from entirely getting caught on the person's body. So overall, we've seen a novel haptic perspective taking technique that combines low-dimensional end effector measurements with model-based learning for predicting high-dimensional force maps across a person's limb. And when we combine these predictions with model predictive control, a robot was able to provide physical dressing assistance from a human-centric perspective based on how their actions would apply force onto a person's body. But one limitation of this approach is that we did not model human motion. Now, there are ways of simulating human motion, but we instead started investigating a more direct way of adapting to human motion. So what I'd like to talk about next is how robots can directly sense human motion. And specifically, I'll introduce a new sensing technique called capacitive servoing to track human motion in real time and navigate a robot's end effector around the human body. So when physically interacting with a person, it can be helpful for robots to sense where a person's body is. And there are a couple of different ways that robots have done this in the past. One of the most common approaches is using visual perception, such as with a camera. For example, you might be familiar with tools like open pose. However, different things like the robot's own body and different objects like fabric garments can all visually occlude sight of a person. Another approach is using force perception, where a robot is using its sense of touch or a force torque sensor in order to estimate where a person's body is at. But this requires robots to be continuously making contact with a person in order to sense them. And more recently, my colleagues in other research groups have demonstrated how robots can use a pressure mat on a bed in order to estimate a person's pose. Yet such approaches struggle with estimating local pose details and performing real-time human motion tracking. But I really want to emphasize, why can't we just use a camera on a robot? It seems like the most intuitive thing to try first. And it turns out that there's a lot of scenarios in physical interaction where substantial parts of the human body become visually occluded. In this case right here, about halfway through this dressing scenario, the robot can no longer see a person's body. Not only is the robot's own arm getting in the way of its cameras, this fabric garment is also visually occluding sight of a person. And this lack of vision is one of the major challenges that capacitive sensing aims to address. And in fact, in this video above here, the robot is using capacitive servoing to adapt to any arm movements made by this participant. Now, in comparison to other pose estimation approaches, capacitive sensing offers robots a number of benefits. It allows robots to sense through some visually opaque materials, such as clothing and wet cloth. It doesn't require robots to make contact with people in order to sense them. And it allows robots to track human motion in real time. So what I'd like to share with you is how we've developed new capacitive sensors that can be used to accurately sense local human pose near a robot's end effector. We use learning to build pose estimation models from capacitance data. And then we evaluate through human studies how robots can use this sensor to perform servoing around the human body and adapt to human motion during physical assistance. But first, what is a capacitive sensor and how does it work? Well, you might be familiar with the classic physics definition of a parallel plate capacitor, where we have two parallel conductive plates. One is a sensor, the other one acts as a ground. And given this setup, we can use a common capacitance equation in order to determine the distance between these two plates. We have some constants, K, which is a dielectric constant, epsilon naught, which is the permittivity of space, as well as a surface area and a capacitance measurement from the sensor. And it turns out we can use this exact same approach to sense the human body. We again have a conductive sensing plate, but now the human body becomes the ground, and we can use similar techniques and equations in order to determine the distance to a person's body. And you're actually probably very familiar with capacitive sensing. You might even use it every single day. Touchscreens on consumer devices use capacitive sensing to detect when we make contact with the screen. Capacitive sensors are common within consumer devices, such as touchscreens, virtual reality controllers, and wearables. Within human-robot interaction, capacitive sensors have frequently been used as a form of proximity sensing to avoid collisions with people and objects. Prior research has also shown how capacitive sensing can be used during object manipulation to perform servoing around stationary objects or to pre-shape an object grasp. However, in comparison to prior work, we explore capacitive sensing for physical robotic assistance. This includes servoing around the contours of human limbs and tracking human limb motion in real time. To start, we developed a single-axis capacitive sensor, which could be either held or mounted to a robot's end effector. And then we explored how a robot could use this sensor to estimate the vertical distance to a person's body in real time when providing assistance. So with this sensor, we collected data from a single human participant as a peer to moved this capacitive sensor downwards towards a person's hand. And we can plot all of this data as shown here, kind of distance versus capacitance. And in order to estimate distance from a capacitance measurement, we used nonlinear least squares optimization to fit a function to this data, a function inspired by the capacitance equation for a parallel plate capacitor. And so this gives us a simple and fast function for estimating the vertical distance from a robot's end effector to a person's hand, or to a person's limb, per se. We then conducted a study with 10 able-bodied participants in which the robot used this capacitive sensing technique to sense and adapt to vertical arm motions made by participants while dressing on two different garments, both a hospital gown and, in this case shown here, a long-sleeve sweater. And in more recent work, we've demonstrated this capacitive sensing technique for providing dressing assistance to individuals with physical disabilities. This same model, optimized for a single able-bodied participant, generalized to people with disabilities, and in this case here, the robot is using a capacitive sensor to adapt dressing trajectories that has learned in simulation. Capacitive sensing is allowing the robot here to adapt to the involuntary vertical motions made by this participant with cerebral palsy while dressing both sleeves of a hospital gown. But there is a limitation here. This single axis sensor can only sense the vertical distance away from a person's limb. It's not able to sense other types of motions or distances, such as this lateral distance, where the person's limb is no longer directly underneath the sensor, nor is it able to sense the orientation of a person's limb in space. So how can we estimate this kind of human motion during physical human-robot interaction? Well, we do so by developing a multi-dimensional capacitive sensor, as shown above here. This sensor consists of a 3x2 grid of copper capacitive electrodes connected to an Arduino microcontroller board. And with this new multi-electrode capacitive sensor, the robot can again sense the human body from about 10 to 15 centimeters away. We can sample capacitance measurements at frequencies over 100 Hertz, yet most importantly, we're able to sense the four-dimensional relative position and orientation of a human limb. But what do I mean by sensing four-dimensional pose? Well, here's a PR2 robot again, and in the center is that capacitive sensor. And if we zoom in, what we're going to be looking at is a point on the person's limb that's closest to the center of the capacitive sensor. So now, given this point, let's look at what is this relative pose that a robot is sensing? What are these four dimensions? Well, the first two are going to be this lateral and vertical distance between the capacitive sensor and the highest point highest nearby point on a person's limb. The third dimension is going to be this pitch orientation between a sensor and an axis running along the surface of a person's limb. And then this last dimension is going to be the yaw orientation between the sensor and the central axis of a limb. And together, this represents the four-dimensional pose of a person's limb that the robot is sensing. And if you're wondering why this isn't 6 dimensions, it's because of the ambiguity along the central axis of a cylindrically shaped limb. So in order for a robot to perform capacitive servoing around the human body, we start by collecting time-varying capacitance measurements from a single human participant as the PR2 moves this capacitive sensor around both the person's arm and leg. And we feed all this data in and train a fully connected feed-forward neural network, which takes as input a window of prior capacitance measurements and outputs an estimated pose of the person's limb at that given time step. And again, note that this model is trained on capacitance data from only a single human participant. And in order to control a robot to perform servoing around the human body, we use a PD controller, or proportional derivative controller, to update the robot's target end effector pose. And this is a fairly straightforward controller, so I'm not going to dive into the details of how it works, but I will note that one of the benefits of using a capacitive sensor is that it enables robots to perform complex assistive tasks like helping someone get dressed or cleaning off their body with very simple control algorithms. We then set up a study with 12 able-bodied participants to evaluate sensing ranges, generalization, and servoing using our 6-electrode capacitive sensor, which is mounted to a robot's end effector. And we began by characterizing the sensing ranges of this sensor and trained pose estimator. And to do this, we computed pose estimation error as the PR2 moved the sensor away from each participant's stationary arm, as shown in the video on the left. And now this figure on the left, it depicts a semicircular planar region of possible end effector positions, which resulted in the error plot on the right. And here, dark blue is low estimation error, whereas green is high error. And the capacitive sensor is working best when the center of the capacitive sensor is at most 15 centimeters from a human arm, where the mean pose estimation error is 1.5 centimeters within this region. We similarly characterize rotational sensing ranges and observe that this capacitive sensing approach is most accurate when the sensor is oriented at most 30 degrees from the human limb. And as discussed a few slides ago, we trained our pose estimator model on capacitance data from only a single human participant. Now, in order to evaluate this model, we then repeated this training data collection process with all 12 participants to essentially form for us a test set. And we then computed the pose estimation error of our model, averaged over all 12 participants for each of the 4 sensing axes. And although our model was trained on only data from a single person, the model exhibited on average less than 2.5 centimeters of position estimation error and less than 10 degrees of orientation error per axis. And we also investigate the benefit of training these pose estimation models on data from more than one human participant. And we did so using a technique called leave one participant out cross-validation. And how we did this is that we retrained the pose estimation network on capacitance measurements from 11 participants. And then we compute the error on data from a single held out participant. We repeat this process and by holding out each of the participants, and the table above here shows the average reward over all 12 training and test sets. But the main takeaway here is that the 2 tables we just saw are actually quite similar. Regardless of whether we're training on capacitance data from a single person or from 11 people, we observed similar pose estimation performance, with less than 0.5 centimeter of difference in pose estimation error, in position estimation error, and less than 1 degree of rotational estimation error. And these results indicate that pose estimation models trained on capacitance measurements from one participant may likely generalize to a larger population of people. And as a part of this work, we also presented a servoing algorithm for a robot to control its end effector both proximally and distally along a human limb using a capacitive sensor, as shown in the video on the left here. And throughout our trials with participants, capacitive servoing was able to keep the robot's end effector on average within 1 centimeter from a target distance away from the human arm, while simultaneously traversing along the arm around a bent elbow. And we also evaluated the case where a robot is navigating along a human leg. Again, capacitive servoing kept the robot's end effector on average within 1 centimeter from a target distance away from the top of a human leg, and it enabled the robot to traverse from the thigh to the ankle around a bent knee. We also conducted a separate study with 4 able-bodied participants in which we demonstrated that this capacitive servoing method can be used by a robot to provide assistance for 2 different activities of daily living. The first we've already seen before, dressing, pulling on the sleeve of a hospital gown onto a person's arm. But the second task is now bathing assistance, in which a robot is using a wet washcloth in order to clean off a person's arm or leg. So in providing dressing assistance, we observed that the robot was able to use capacitive servoing to sense and adapt to human motion, such as these lateral arm movements and rotations that we see above here. And in the next part of our experiments, we assessed how the robot can use this same approach to assist with another task, bathing, where here the robot is using capacitive servoing along with a wet washcloth in order to navigate and clean off the surface of a person's leg. And overall, we find that this approach, it works well, but it isn't perfect. Sensing the human limb through wet cloth is more challenging for capacitive sensing. And here's an example in which the robot failed to fully clean off the leg, where it briefly lost track of the leg near the knee. And this resulted in the robot missing some of this blue powder near the knee. We also looked at another case here, bathing assistance along the human arm. And despite only being trained on a single human participant and with limited training data, capacitive servoing was still able to generalize across multiple people with varying sized limbs and generalize across both arms and legs. So overall, capacitive servoing is a new technique that enables robots to both follow trajectories along the body and track human motion in real time. We've developed new capacitive sensors for robots to accurately sense the human body. We've trained pose estimation models based on capacitance data. And then we've performed evaluations through human studies in which we found that the servoing approach generalizes well across people for multiple physical assistance tasks. But there remains a question here. How can we train robots to be versatile caregivers? How do we give robots common sense around people? What we'd like is for a robot to have common sense that's applicable across many different people and for many different tasks. And historically, there's been well over a decade of active work on designing robotic systems to physically assist people with tasks ranging from feeding and drinking to dressing to hygiene assistance. Yet in almost every case, it's a single robot helping a small group of people with only a single task. Robots aren't able to learn common sense about the human body that generalizes across multiple tasks or scenarios. And this is because there are some huge hurdles in the field of physical human-robot interaction. First, capable real-world robots are not cheap. Conducting human studies is also not that cheap, and this has arguably been one of the largest barriers of entry for researchers into the field. There are also risks associated with robots coming into physical contact with people, and we would never want robots to accidentally hurt someone or put someone at risk. And then lastly, collecting data and performing evaluations on a real robot interacting with real people is really slow. And this is especially true when interacting with people with disabilities. These challenges limit not only the kinds of research we can do, but who can do this kind of research. But what if we could use physics simulation to overcome these challenges? At the beginning of this talk, we saw how a real robot was able to leverage simulation in order to predict the forces that are being applied onto the human body and dress these deformable garments. And physics simulation could be generalized towards training versatile assistive robots and learning common sense, simulating many different robots, helping many people with a variety of tasks. Recently, there's been a growing push for multitask simulation environments where we can train or evaluate robots across a large number of diverse tasks. Yet, most of these are within a robot manipulation or navigation context. In fact, there's a complete lack of simulating robots physically interacting with people in any framework. And so that's what brings us to the final chapter of our story here: how physics simulation can open up entirely new research directions and opportunities within physical human-robot interaction. So towards versatile and intelligent robotic caregivers, my research has recently introduced Assistive Gym, the first open source physics-based simulation framework for modeling physical human-robot interaction and robotic assistance. Now, with simulation, my research has been investigating how we can use this tool to develop versatile, intelligent robotic caregivers. We've introduced several physics-based environments for physical assistance. We've developed baselines and benchmarks for robotic caregiving, And we've investigated generalization of physical human-robot interaction from a number of angles, including human motion, preferences, and variation in human body shape and impairments. One of the first research opportunities that we gained with simulation is the ability to train versatile assistive robots and develop control algorithms towards common sense reasoning. For example, we've developed physics-based environments where robots have learned to assist people with different tasks associated with activities of daily living, such as bathing, feeding, or dressing assistance. And these tasks are selected from literature such that if we were to have versatile robots that could help with them, it would have real-world impact and be meaningful to many people with disabilities. Physics simulation also enables us to establish benchmarks and baselines for physical human-robot interaction. This is something that the field of computer vision has done remarkably well at, and I believe physical HRI can benefit from that same mindset. So towards this goal, we introduced a set of baseline control policies with Assistive Gym, each trained with proximal policy optimization and actor-critic deep reinforcement learning technique. And in total, we trained 24 policies, one for each task and robot combination in Assistive Gym, where each policy is trained for 50,000 simulation rollouts or trials. And then we selected the best policy out of 3 random seeds. And the first question we should be thinking about is, well, how well do these baselines perform in simulation? So when assisting a person who holds a static pose, these baseline controllers were able to achieve reasonable performance for several of the assistive tasks, including itch scratching, bed bathing, feeding, and drinking assistance, as shown here. But it's also worth noting that there's still significant room for improvement and future research. These are just baseline controllers. They're not solving the field of robotic care for us. And a very clear example of this is that all robots struggle to provide dressing and arm manipulation assistance to an inactive human. Yet by simulating physical interaction, we can now create reproducible benchmarks for assistive robotics. We can now quantify how various robots and controllers are performing when interacting with people across different tasks. This table shown here shows the average reward the baseline controllers achieved for each task and robot combination, where bolding represents the best robot for a given task. And creating physical interaction benchmarks like this is something that's exceptionally difficult and costly to do in the real world. Another research direction that we gain with physics simulation is the ability to design techniques for generalizing assistive robots across varying human body shapes, weights, and impairments. If, for example, we wanted to train or evaluate an assistive robotic system on 50,000 people with different body sizes and disabilities, in simulation, this would take maybe 6 to 12 hours, fully automated. And on the left is a visualization from ongoing research where we're investigating assistive robots that can generalize across a large distribution of human body proportions, weights, and impairments. Yet in the real world, 50,000 participants is immediately disqualified. That is far too large of a number. And we instead think, well, let's just test on 10 able-bodied college students instead. And this will still take a week to do a study like that. If we want 10 real participants with disabilities, it's a much slower process. It could easily take over a month to conduct a real-world study like that. So again, physics simulation opens up a number of exciting and new research directions for physical HRI and robotic caregiving, which my research has begun to investigate. Now, there are several other extensions or research directions that sadly I don't have the time to talk about in depth today, but I would like to just briefly mention them. So we've investigated modeling and benchmarking human motion in Assistive Gym. And to do this, we used a co-optimization technique to learn collaborative human motion. And we found that pretty much across the board, robots are able to provide more successful assistance to active collaborative humans. Assistive Gym also provides a reward-based structure for modeling human preferences. And this has allowed us to train robots that adapt their assistance to different preferences. And we found that modeling preferences became necessary for robots to exhibit more common sense, such as not throwing water or food at people. Physics simulation has also enabled us to design a new course on robotic caregivers, which I have co-developed and co-instructed at Georgia Tech for 2 semesters now with Professor Charlie Kemp. And Assistive Gym has enabled students to learn new concepts without risking expensive robots and explore human-robot studies without needing to deal with IRB approval. Yet, if we take a step back again and look at what we've seen so far with Assistive Gym, everything exists solely in simulation. However, we're interested in robots one day providing assistance to real people. Yet for assistive robotics, people are one of the greatest sources of variation between simulation and the real world. So can we evaluate simulation-trained robots with real people? And our approach to this was introducing Assistive Vr Gym, a way of safely evaluating and improving simulation-trained robots with real people. So Assistive Vr Gym is a new approach that uses virtual reality to help bridge the gap between simulation and the real world by bringing real people into physics simulation to receive assistance from virtual robots. Now, within robotics, virtual reality is often used as a method for teleoperation or providing demonstrations to a robot. VR has also been used within a rehabilitation robotics context for training and assessing rehab metrics. But rather than having people take control of a robot, we're using virtual reality to take control of a virtual human model to physically interact with virtual assistive robots. And this may seem a little unusual at first, but virtual reality is giving us a number of benefits. It allows us to collect real human motion trajectories and evaluate simulation-trained robots with real people. And we can do all of this while negating the risks associated with physical interaction. Assistive VR Gym couples virtual reality with the assistive gym environments, and here are 3 perspectives of what that VR setup looks like, both in the real world and in simulation. And now, if you recall, we had seen this slide just a little while ago where we had trained these baseline controllers for each task in Assistive Gym. But when we started testing these baseline policies in early pilot studies, we observed that these policies didn't work at all with real people. This was a bit surprising to us since everything in simulation was working fairly well. These policies were able to provide assistance to simulated people, but they're now completely failing with real people. And that's where virtual reality came into play. What VR exposed is that the distribution of human biomechanics in simulation did not match the distribution of real human biomechanics. Namely, this is a variation in human body shape and waist bending orientations. And so by using virtual reality, we were able to improve the biomechanics of simulated people and then train improved robot policies based on these new biomechanics. And so now we have 2 different sets of policies, both an original set of baseline policies and now these newly trained improved policies based on improved biomechanics. And this allowed us to set up a formal study with 8 able-bodied participants in which participants received assistance from these virtual robotic caregivers. And in comparison to the original baseline policies, these new improved policies were now able to better generalize to assisting real people in VR. Participants also noted that virtual reality gave them a sense of presence where they felt like they were actually there interacting with a robot. For itch scratching assistance, the original baseline policies didn't work a single time in VR, but the new improved policies were now able to provide itch scratching assistance in 62% of the trials that we've tested with participants. And similarly for drinking assistance, the improved policies are now starting to succeed with real people. And sort of icing on the cake is that we can use data from our human study in virtual reality to statistically analyze if human biomechanics really did differ between simulation and real people. So using a Wilcoxon signed rank test, we observed a statistically significant difference in human body shape between the original assistive gym environments and real people in VR, but we did not find a statistically significant difference between the new improved human biomechanics and participants in VR. And we get similar results by applying this statistical test to human waist movements, where again, the improved simulation biomechanics better match real human biomechanics. So after all of this, we've now seen how physics simulation opens up exciting and new research directions for physical human-robot interaction and robotic caregiving, developing new assistive environments, benchmarking physical interaction, and designing techniques for generalization and adaptation. We've also seen a virtual reality technique for bridging the reality gap, allowing us to evaluate simulation-trained robots with real people, improve these physically assisted robots, and then collect training data with real human motion. And we can do all of this without the risks associated with physical interaction. So at this point, we've now discussed 3 different techniques towards enabling robots to intelligently interact with and assist people on a physical level. And we introduced these to begin overcoming some of the core challenges in robotic caregiving that arise when performing close physical interactions between robots and people. But robotic caregiving is a huge research direction, which means that there's still a lot of open questions on how to develop these intelligent physical interactions. One such future research opportunity is the development of new multimodal sensing techniques for robots to sense and interact with the human body. Now, I have research on multimodal haptic sensing for material recognition, which wasn't the focus of this talk, but I would like to just briefly discuss it as it opens up opportunities for robots to better interact with the human body. I've investigated multimodal force, vibration, and active temperature sensing coupled with semi-supervised learning for material recognition of household objects. More recently, I've been interested in how robots can use near-infrared spectroscopy with what are known as microspectrometers. And as it turns out, spectrometers are really good at recognizing household materials. And then I've coupled spectroscopy with high-resolution texture imaging, which has allowed us to investigate pixel-level recognition. And future research could investigate how robots could leverage all of this local sensory information to inform their interactions with people. Now, if there's only one thing you take away from this talk, that main takeaway is that all of this research is working towards the development of intelligent robotic caregivers that can one day assist people who require daily care and physical assistance with activities of daily living. So wrapping up, I'd like to thank the amazing group of undergraduate and master's students whom I've had the honor of mentoring throughout my PhD. A lot of the research that I presented today was made possible because of them and their contributions. And several of these students are now PhD students themselves or on their way to soon becoming so. And of course, a thank you to my outstanding collaborators that have helped make my research possible, especially with conducting studies and developing research ideas. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending. It's been a joy sharing this research with you, and I'd be happy to take any questions now.